Rock and roll has always embraced a rebellious attitude, so it's no shock that some of its most legendary figures have ended up in jail. Many of these arrests have involved drugs. Icons like Mick Jagger, Ozzy Osbourne, David Bowie, and Glenn Frey of the Eagles have all spent time behind bars due to drug-related charges. Paul McCartney also made headlines when he was detained in Japan for carrying a large stash of marijuana, leading to several days behind bars. Some rock stars had brief encounters with the law, while others faced serious consequences. Let's take a look at 40 rock stars who did time in jail. 1. Mick Jagger. The Rolling Stones have had their fair share of legal troubles, and Mick Jagger is no exception. His most infamous arrest happened in 1967 at bandmate Keith Richards' countryside home, where police found a stash of amphetamines. Initially sentenced to 3 months in Brixton Prison, Jagger ended up serving only a couple of days. 2. Keith Richards. Keith Richards was also caught in the same 1967 raid, though his punishment was harsher. While Jagger got off relatively easy, Richards was sentenced to a full year behind bars. However, he served just 2 months before being released. 3. Ozzy Osbourne. Ozzy Osbourne has had multiple brushes with the law, starting in 1965 when he was a teenager. He spent 7 weeks in a Birmingham prison for failing to pay fines related to a burglary charge. Years later, in 1989, Osbourne found himself in jail again, this time for attempting to strangle his wife, Sharon. 4. Tommy Lee. In 1998, Motley Crue drummer Tommy Lee was sentenced to 6 months in jail for assaulting his then-wife, Pamela Anderson. While he was behind bars, Anderson filed for divorce. The two briefly reconciled after his release, but their relationship ultimately fell apart for good. 5. Nikki Sixx. While traveling on a Japanese bullet train, Motley Crue bassist Nikki Sixx threw a whiskey bottle at bandmate Mick Mars, but instead, it hit an innocent passenger. Sixx and the band's manager, Doc McGee, were promptly arrested. The police offered to release them if they wrote apology letters. Sixx initially refused and spent hours in a holding cell before finally giving in. 6. Axel Rose. Before becoming famous with Guns N' Roses, Axl Rose had a turbulent youth. As a teenager, he was arrested over 20 times for various offenses, from public intoxication to battery. Rose spent several months in jail before heading to Los Angeles at the age of 20. His rebellious nature didn't end there. Even as a star, he found himself facing assault charges, including confrontations with security, airport staff, and even his neighbors. While some of these altercations resulted in fines, Rose never served additional jail time after his early years. 7. David Bowie. In 1976, David Bowie found himself behind bars for a night after police discovered half a pound of marijuana in his hotel room. Alongside Iggy Pop, Bowie was arrested and later released on a $2,000 bail. The charges against him were eventually dropped, but this brief encounter with the law became one of the more famous moments in his colorful career. 8. Paul McCartney. In January 1980, Paul McCartney was about to start a tour in Japan with Wings when he was stopped at customs. Officials discovered nearly half a pound of marijuana in his luggage. As a result, the former Beatle spent 9 days in a Japanese jail before being deported. The tour was canceled, and McCartney had to refund the promoters. He later claimed he wasn't aware that marijuana was illegal in Japan. 9. Vince Neil. Motley Crue's history is forever linked to the tragic death of Hanoi Rocks drummer Razzle. In 1984, Vince Neil was driving drunk when he crashed his car into another vehicle, killing Razzle and seriously injuring others. Neil was convicted of vehicular manslaughter and DUI, receiving a 30-day jail sentence and a $2.6 million restitution order. He served just 15 days before being released on good behavior. 10. Kurt Cobain. As a teenager in his hometown of Aberdeen, Washington, Kurt Cobain developed a reputation for his rebellious behavior, including spray painting graffiti. One of his favorite phrases was, "God is gay," which would later appear in Nirvana's song Stay Away. While tagging one night with Buzz Osborne, aka King Buzzo of the Melvins, Cobain was caught by the police and spent the night in jail. The specific phrase Cobain was caught writing, "Ain't got no how, whatchamacallit." 11. David Crosby. In April 1982, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young's David Crosby found himself deep in the grip of addiction when he was arrested in a Dallas nightclub for freebasing cocaine and carrying a .45 caliber handgun. After being convicted a year later, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but served only 9 months. This experience served as a wake-up call for Crosby, who quit cocaine and later wrote a thank you letter to the judge who sentenced him, acknowledging that the experience helped turn his life around. 12. John Bonham. Led Zeppelin's legendary drummer John Bonham spent a night in jail just before the band's performance at the Texas International Pop Festival in 1969. Bonham had been drinking heavily, and after falling down a flight of stairs and breaking his toe or ankle, he was arrested for being abusive. Despite his injury and night in jail, Bonham made it to the gig the next day, hobbling around with a crutch but still managing to perform. 13. Iggy Pop. Iggy Pop wasn't just a punk rock icon, he was also no stranger to the law. Besides the infamous arrest alongside David Bowie, Pop accumulated numerous other charges, including several for flashing his genitals on stage. One of his most memorable moments came when he was arrested for being drunk and disorderly. When a friend came to bail him out, they asked, "Iggy, why are you wearing a woman's dress?" To which Pop famously replied, "I beg to differ, this is a man's dress." 14. Janice Joplain. On November 16, 1969, during a performance in Tampa, Florida, Janice Joplain faced a legal issue when a rowdy crowd caused the situation to escalate. As security tried to control the audience, Joplain used strong language to criticize the police. After the show, she was arrested backstage for bad-mouthing officers and using vulgar language. Joplain spent the night in jail and was released on bond the following morning. 15. Jim Morrison. The notorious frontman of The Doors, Jim Morrison, was arrested multiple times throughout his life, often due to his intoxication and defiance of authority. His charges ranged from public drunkenness to indecent exposure, and he became infamous for provoking officers. In one of his most notable incidents, he was arrested after performing an act of simulated masturbation during a 1969 concert. Morrison was convicted of public exposure and profanity, but tragically died before he could appeal the conviction. 16. James Brown. James Brown, the godfather of soul, had several run-ins with the law throughout his life. At just 16 years old, he was convicted of theft after stealing clothes from parked cars in 1949. Later, in 1988, Brown was arrested for assault, and a month later for drug and weapon violations. The following September, he was involved in a high-speed chase with police, leading to charges of assaulting an officer and driving-related offenses. Brown was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but served only 2 before being released. 17. Scott Wyland. Scott Wyland, the iconic frontman of Stone Temple Pilots, had a turbulent relationship with the law, largely due to his ongoing battle with substance abuse. In 1999, he was sentenced to a year in jail for violating probation stemming from a heroin possession conviction, though he spent much of his sentence in a rehabilitation facility. Wyland's struggle with sobriety continued, and in 2008, he found himself back behind bars for 8 days after a DUI conviction. 18. Steven Tyler. In March 1967, Aerosmith's legendary frontman Steven Tyler was arrested at the age of 18 in Yonkers, New York for marijuana possession. Though the details surrounding his arrest remain hazy, Tyler himself admits he doesn't remember much of it. He was likely held for just a few hours before being released. 19. Bon Scott. Before becoming the frontman of AC/DC, Bon Scott had a troubled past. In 1963, at the age of 17, Scott was arrested for escaping police custody, stealing a patrol car, and committing statutory rape with a 15-year-old girl. While his actions were serious, his brother Derek Scott later reflected that his time in jail helped him mature. Derek believed that the experience of responsibility and self-reflection helped set Bon on a new path, even inspiring him to form a band with other inmates. When Bon was released, he had found a new sense of direction in life. 20. Phil Rudd. AC/DC's drummer Phil Rudd made headlines in 2014 when he was arrested in New Zealand for possession of methamphetamine and cannabis, and for making threats to kill a former employee. As part of a plea deal, Rudd was sentenced to 8 months of home confinement. However, in 2015, he was sent to jail after breaching the conditions of his parole. After serving his time, Rudd was released back to house arrest and vowed to turn his life around, putting an end to his destructive lifestyle. 21. Glenn Frey. In 1973, Glenn Frey of the Eagles was arrested in Columbus, Ohio for public intoxication and possession of a hallucinogen. After spending the night in jail, he paid a fine and was released. Remarkably, Frey performed the next day at the Springfest at Southern Illinois University, barely missing a beat in his musical career. 22. Keith Moon. Keith Moon, the infamous drummer for The Who, is remembered for his chaotic and reckless antics. One of his most notorious incidents took place in 1975 in Scotland. After a flight was grounded due to fog, Moon verbally abused an airport staff member, knocked over a computer, hijacked a wheelchair, and rode it down a flight of stairs while waving a fake gun. The police arrested him, and he spent the night in jail. The next morning, he paid a fine in front of a judge and joked to reporters that it was the best sleep he'd had in years. 23. Ike Turner. Ike Turner, known for his musical contributions and turbulent personal life, had multiple legal issues over the years, ranging from drug possession to assault. In 1980, he was convicted of cocaine possession after a SWAT team raided his Los Angeles studio and found drugs and a live hand grenade. He was arrested again in 1989 for trying to sell cocaine to an undercover officer. Turner was convicted of cocaine intoxication and DUI, receiving a 4-year prison sentence. He was released after serving 18 months in September 1991. 24. Richie Sambora. In 2008, Bon Jovi's guitarist Richie Sambora was arrested for driving under the influence, DUI, after failing a field sobriety test. While he was cooperative during the process, he spent 5 hours in jail before being released. Facing up to 6 months in jail, Sambora pled guilty and was instead given probation. 25. Johnny Rotten. Johnny Rotten, aka John Lydon of the Sex Pistols, was arrested in Ireland after a bartender refused to serve him. The police were called, and Lydon humorously described the incident as attacking a policeman's fist with my face. After being arrested, he was stripped, thrown into a yard, and hosed down by the police. The charges were quickly dismissed, but Lydon swore off playing in Ireland for over 20 years. 26. Sid Vicious. Sid Vicious, the infamous bassist for the Sex Pistols, is most remembered for his tragic involvement in the death of his girlfriend, Nancy Spungen, who was found stabbed in their hotel room. Vicious was arrested for her death but was released on bail. He was later arrested for assault but died from a heroin overdose while still out on bail and awaiting trial. 27. Phil Spector. Legendary producer Phil Spector was arrested in 2003 for the murder of actress Lana Clarkson. Spector claimed her death was accidental, but after a retrial in 2009, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 19 years in prison. He died in 2021 while still incarcerated. 28. Joe Strummer. The Clash's Joe Strummer had his fair share of run-ins with the law, often stemming from physical altercations with authorities. In 1977, he was arrested after stealing a pillowcase from the Holiday Inn, and in 1980, he was taken into custody after hitting an audience member in the head with his guitar during a performance in Germany. 29. Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa found himself behind bars in 1965 after a bizarre encounter with an undercover cop who offered him $100 for an audio tape of Zappa having sex with his girlfriend. Zappa was arrested for conspiracy to commit pornography, but he ultimately pleaded no contest to a misdemeanor. After spending 10 days in jail, Zappa had a new perspective on the US penal system. 30. Jerry Lee Lewis. Jerry Lee Lewis had a chaotic life filled with controversy. One of his more memorable arrests came in 1976 when, after a drunken drive without a license, he showed up at Graceland demanding to see Elvis Presley. When security guards refused, Lewis, brandishing a gun and still intoxicated, was arrested and spent the night in jail in Memphis. 31. Arthur Lee. Arthur Lee, frontman of the band Love, had numerous brushes with the law, including convictions for arson and drug-related offenses. In 1996, he was convicted of negligent discharge of a firearm and sentenced to 12 years under California's 3 strikes law. Lee served over 5 years before his release in 2001. He continued to tour before his death in 2006. 32. Eddie Vedder. Eddie Vedder, frontman of Pearl Jam, was arrested in 1993 after a street fight in New Orleans. He was charged with public drunkenness and disturbing the peace, spending the night in jail. This arrest was a brief but notable episode in Vedder's otherwise clean record. 33. Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry's long criminal history included a conviction for armed robbery as a teenager. He also served time in 1962 for transporting a 14-year-old girl across state lines for sex. Berry spent around 20 months in prison for that crime. He also faced multiple charges of sexual assault and abuse in the late 80s and 90s, but avoided jail time for most of those cases. 34. Gary Glitter. Gary Glitter, known for the hit Rock and Roll Part 2, had a disturbing criminal record. He was convicted of possessing child pornography in 1997 and served 2 months in jail. Later, he moved to Vietnam, where he was arrested for engaging in sex with underage girls. He served 3 years in a Vietnamese prison and was deported back to the UK, where he was convicted in 2014 for historical sexual offenses and sentenced to 16 years in prison. He briefly got out in 2023 but was jailed again for breaching parole. 35. Jim Gordon. Jim Gordon, best known as the drummer for Derek and the Dominoes, was convicted of murder after he killed his 71-year-old mother in 1983. Gordon had developed schizophrenia and claimed that voices had instructed him to commit the crime. He was sentenced to 16 years to life in prison and died while incarcerated in 2023. 36. John Phillips. John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas was arrested in the 80s for drug-related offenses. He had been using stolen prescription pads to get medication, which he then traded for other drugs. He was caught in a sting operation and faced up to 45 years in prison, but received a suspended 8-year sentence. Phillips only spent a month in jail. 37. Marcus Malone. Marcus Malone was a drummer who briefly worked with Santana before getting into serious legal trouble. In 1969, Malone got into a dispute over an affair he had with a woman, leading him to stab the woman's husband. The man later died, and Malone was convicted of manslaughter. He spent 3 years in prison, but never returned to music after his release, eventually becoming homeless. He passed away in 2021 at the age of 77. 38. Billy Preston. Billy Preston, the famous keyboardist for the Beatles and Rolling Stones, had multiple stints in jail. In 1992, he was sentenced to 30 days for violating probation after a previous drunk driving conviction. 5 years later, he was sentenced to 3 years for cocaine possession and added time for insurance fraud after setting fire to his house. He served 18 months of a 4-year sentence. 39. Ian Brown. Stone Roses frontman Ian Brown was arrested in 1998 after an altercation on a plane. Brown, who was arguing with a flight attendant, became more aggressive when a pilot intervened. Brown began banging on the cockpit door, resulting in his arrest for threatening behavior. He spent 2 months in prison for the outburst. 40. Steve Earle. Country singer Steve Earle's battles with drugs led to multiple arrests. In 1993, he was arrested for heroin possession, and a year later, he was caught with cocaine and weapons. Earle was sentenced to a year in jail, but served only 60 days before being released. He went on to enter a drug treatment program and later incorporated his experiences with addiction and recovery into his music. While rock stars are often celebrated for their rebellious spirit, their run-ins with the law have been just as legendary as their music. Some learned from their mistakes, while others repeated them, leaving behind stories that are both cautionary tales and reminders of rock and roll's wild side.